I think you have to look at the sources of the money. And people say APAC. Well, APAC is not involved in everything, but it's involved in a lot.
So Douglas Macgregor was recently on Judge Napolitano's podcast talking about who controls U.S. foreign policy in the context of Ukraine and Israel. And as he said, APAC controls a lot, but not everything. But I think if we watch this, we'll be surprised by the number of different power centers that pull the strings on U.S. foreign policy. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Colonel, who controls American foreign policy?
Oh boy, I think that we have, first of all, these words, the deep state, always bother me because people say, well, that's the bureaucracy. Well, my own experience with the so-called federal bureaucracy, in whatever form you want to approach it, military, intelligence, or anything else, is certainly in the grip of a lot of inertia. In other words, to give you a quick example, after '92, when it became abundantly clear that the Soviet Union was crumbling and there was no threat whatsoever from the Soviet side against the West, we continued to do the things, we continued to observe the things, track the things, watch the things that we had done for 30, 40 years during the Cold War. In other words, nothing really changed. So in that sense, I think you've got a bureaucracy that's very, very resistant to changing, to adopt a new position or new perspectives. But when you say who actually controls foreign policy, I think today we have to say clearly oligarchic billionaires who are mega donors, who have effectively bought the Hill. And
Miriam Adelson.
And when I say bought the Hill, I mean buy it through contributions. And they've also made it clear, if you look at the 4 stars that are out there that have retired, those who have been most vocal in their advocacy for conflict and confrontation with the Russians, with the Chinese, with Iran, they are very wealthy men because they have been hired into firms in New York City, financial firms that reward them for their continued commitment to conflict overseas. And you also have people that are employed in various so-called think tanks, which is kind of an oxymoron. I think they're just advocacy tanks, which is, I think, what Chaz Freeman likes to call them. So I think you have to look at the sources of the money. And people say APAC. Well, APAC is not involved in everything, but it's involved in a lot. But it is focused really like a laser on what they think is the international Jewish interest. Not just Israel, but the larger diaspora's interest.
Yeah, Douglas Macgregor is generally right here. I think he doesn't fully appreciate the amount of power that the deep state bureaucracy does have, and in specific, the CIA. We know from declassified documents and whistleblowers that the CIA has been leading regime change operations as, the forward-facing U.S. foreign policy device, for more than 50 years, and that's probably being a little bit generous. Actually, since the early 1950s, when the CIA played a role in overthrowing not only Iran's government, but also Guatemala. So this has happened since the start of the CIA, when it transitioned from the OSS to the CIA, and we know it from many different materials. We know that the CIA comes up with propaganda to sell it. There's always a latest boogeyman. At one point it was Saddam, at one point it was Assad, at one point, and now it still is Putin. It's often Hamas. Anything to draw millions and billions and trillions of dollars from the U.S. taxpayer to send it to foreign military operations, especially involving regime change. Of course, he's right. There's other influences too. The military-industrial complex is one. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and Boeing arguably control U.S. foreign policy to a farther extent, even than some elected officials too, because the elected officials can't help but yield to all of their demands for weaponry and funding.
So it would be wrong to say that they control foreign policy, but they have a huge impact. And there are others with a lot of money in Washington, D.C. that have an impact as well.
So is the likely...
I don't think the president of the United States is a free agent.
Yeah, it sure seems to be the case because despite all the theatrics, all the different kinds of rhetoric in presidential competitions, no matter the parties involved, no matter the personalities involved, we all seem to get the general same foreign policy from the US, where the Overton window is not should we bomb countries or should we not bomb countries? It's always which countries should we bomb? Which countries should we get embroiled with in terms of entangling alliances? How many military bases, new ones to build overseas? How many sanctions to lay upon so-called enemy nations to exert our foreign policy will? That has happened regardless of the presidential occupant. It's not an anti-Trump thing. It's not an anti-Obama, anti-Bush thing. In fact, it's kind of anti all of them because they clearly don't have the power all the time.
Is it a likely scenario that elements of the CIA knew about this? The director did not. The director of national intelligence did not. The secretary of defense probably did. And nobody told the president of the United States.
To be clear, I think what he's referencing here is supposedly Ukraine's drone strike on Russia's nuclear bombers, I believe last week. It was some time ago, and there's been increased discussion on it as to whether or not Ukraine was actually involved, that they were Ukrainian drones. A lot of people have suggested, including Max Blumenthal, that it was possibly MI6.
I can't speak for Tulsi Gabbard. I don't know what she's aware of as the director of national intelligence because she has a lot on her plate, so to say. But clearly, Radcliffe would have known everything, I would suspect, from the beginning. And I don't know who briefs the president. You'll recall that when President Trump was in office the first time around and Mr. Pompeo was appointed to head the CIA, he personally came across to the White House every morning to brief President Trump.
Of course he did.
And he did that for various reasons. Obviously, he was cultivating him because he wanted to exploit Trump for as much as he could get out of him on his road to the presidency, or at least at the time, so he thought. But I would think that the CIA director very definitely was aware. I would think that the National Security Advisor, whoever that is, would be aware. And I guess at this point, that's Marco Rubio. So if Marco Rubio is actually involved in doing the job on the National Security Council staff, he would have known.
Yeah, the Trump administration has to play this as if they didn't know, because if they did know, it squashes all chance of negotiating peace with Russia, which is not necessarily what is desired from some of these neocons, but they have to play it that way. Otherwise, they face potential retaliation from Russia. If they knew about this, Trump can never be trusted as a negotiation partner, and that's what he does want to be trusted for, but there are forces within his administration that want to prolong the war. Again, it's really hard for me to believe that the CIA did not know about this, especially because the NATO side and Ukraine has said this operation took 18 months of planning. Now, 18 months of planning means 18 months of opportunities for word to slip of it, for intelligence to be placed in the wrong hands regarding it. All the moving pieces would cause compounded risk. It's really almost impossible for me to believe that the CIA wasn't aware of this. And it's disastrous because this is clearly the biggest escalation of the war in Ukraine since Trump took office, and it poses a real prospect that Putin decides to inflict additional casualties in terms of increased offenses, possibly southwest as far as Odessa. Maybe take that. And it doesn't seem like peace is on the horizon anytime soon.
Do you think that President Putin, and then I want to jump to Israel and Iran, do you think President Putin will respond to all of this with drama and ferocity, or do you think he'll continue his slow, patient, methodical, winning ways?
Yes.
This is a very important question because conditions have changed. The Ukrainian military establishment is in ruins. It doesn't present much resistance any longer. Tens and thousands of Ukrainian troops are being slaughtered every week as they try to withdraw, disengage, and avoid contact with the Russians. there are undoubtedly discussions right now at the highest levels in Moscow between President Putin, his advisors, and I would think the general staff. And I think the tenor of the discussion is as follows. Do we continue on our current path, or do we strike decisively? And when I mean strike, I'm not talking about missiles and rockets, because I think it should have become pretty clear at this point that regardless of how many missiles you launch, how many rockets are launched, and how many critical infrastructure targets are destroyed or people may be killed, that's not going to end the war, because Mr. Zelensky will sit quietly in his bunker in Kiev. He'll collect whatever cash is sent his way. He'll do whatever he can to maintain the fiction that Ukraine is a real nation state, which I don't think it is anymore, and that he is in control of something, when in reality he controls Kiev and he controls some of the weapon systems that can reach into Russia, but not too much else. So I think the question is, what do we do? Do we keep doing what we're doing, or do we move into Kiev and take the city? Do we cross the river, go down to Odessa, turn Ukraine's rump state into a landlocked state, which is important because most of the arms and support that comes to Ukraine, perhaps most is a strong word, but an awful lot of it comes from the sea, from the Black Sea. And then finally, he's already made a decision to send 10,000 more Russian troops to Moldova, to the Transnistrian Republic, which is Russian, in the southern and eastern part of Moldova. Well, that's a stone's throw from Odessa. So if he's going to do that, he might as well just take Odessa. He's not going to get an agreement out of anybody. Nobody's going to sign up for anything right now. So why sit quietly and hurl missiles at Ukraine when you...
Yeah, I think that is the question that Russia has to answer. And, I'm knowing if I don't know that Putin is methodical and cerebral. He's not prone to emotional outbursts or, radical rhetoric at times like Trump is. He's methodical in his approach. But Macgregor is so right here when he says Zelensky is acting just as a fundraiser and a propagandist, trying to prop up the false hope that this war is winnable on the Ukraine side. And the whole Western media seems to be aligned behind him. They've made, this the biggest story, attached to sub-stories and subtext that says, hey, maybe Ukraine can win the war after all, even though that strike seems to have only damaged, 3 to 7 airplanes, depending on who you believe, nuclear bombers. So this is incredibly absurd. It's been able to kind of act as a red herring that obscures the actual reality on the ground and in the trenches, and that is where the Donbass is still controlled by Russia. Basically has been for the most part since the beginnings of the war. Now, there have been several Ukrainian offenses, the biggest one, I believe, in the summer of 2024, but have been completely broken up by the beginning of this year. They still occupy 85 or 90% or so of the Donbass. They could potentially occupy more. I think that Putin was generally interested in wrapping this thing up. And based on what's happened, especially in regard to this nuclear bomber thing, which isn't significant in terms of the grand scale of the war, does seem to dissuade him from believing that the West or NATO or the US really wants this war to end. So I think John Mearsheimer was completely correct when he said that the U.S. led Ukraine down the primrose path. NATO and the U.S. did that. They said that this would be roses and glory, and it's turned out to be a bloody catastrophe. Mostly prices paid on the Ukrainian side. And no Western nation, despite all the rhetoric in the world, from the most pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO zealots imaginable, is going to say, we're going to send our forces on the ground in Ukraine, start a hot war with Russia. They're not going to do that. So here's where we're left.
Ukraine is already defeated. I think that's the discussion that's going on.
Right.
I'd be surprised if there were any other kind of discussion.
Yeah, Douglas Macgregor made some really good points here in terms of who controls U.S. foreign policy. It's simple to just say AIPAC, but there are many elements involved. You have duplicitous CIA and intelligence directors like Mike Pompeo, who certainly tried to steer Trump down a more bellicose foreign policy route. You had Trump's top generals at times lying to him about troop presence so it would prolong specific wars, notably in the Middle East. But the Israel lobby does command a lot of, a lot of political wherewithal too, especially when you fund the president to the tune of $100 million, which Miriam Adelson did. And basically every congressman has a specific designated AIPAC guy assigned to them, which we know from Thomas Massey's revelations. But we're in a stalemate in Ukraine to some extent, but maybe that's not the right word for it, because Russia's still in the driver's seat, despite this attack that's taken up all the headlines. And it's really the purpose of this attack was to drum up additional support and funding for Ukraine. We'll see if it happens in the Senate. We'll see if it happens in the House, if they're going to pass this sanctions bill toward Russia. But I don't see peace anytime soon. But I do want to hear from what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think that the war between Ukraine and Russia is the most tense it's been since the start of the Trump presidency? And do you see peace anytime soon? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire, and no more war in Ukraine. Take it easy, guys. I'll see you in the next one.